Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of a journey born from conviction and a call that echoed across a divided nation. We begin in the final days of winter in the year 1965. In the city of Boston, the air carried a lingering, biting chill that seeped through the window frames of a modest home in the neighborhood of Roxbury. Inside, the world was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of a television set in the corner of the living room. James Reeb, a 38-year-old minister with a gentle face and dark-rimmed glasses, sat with his wife, Marie. The light from the screen flickered against the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched toward the ceiling. It was the evening of March 7th. On the screen, the grainy black and white images revealed a bridge in a place called Selma, Alabama. James watched, his breath hitching in his chest, as the flickering light showed a line of marchers being met with a wall of state troopers. He saw the plumes of tear gas rising like ghostly clouds into the southern sky. He heard the muffled thud of nightsticks and the cries of people who asked only for the right to be heard. The silence in the Roxbury living room became heavy, thick with the weight of what they were witnessing. The smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney drifted through the vents, but for James, the world had narrowed down to that bridge, those people, and a deep, unsettling stirring in his soul. The next morning, the gray light of a Boston Monday filtered through the clouds. James went about his work for the American Friends Service Committee, but his mind remained tethered to the images of the night before. Then, the call arrived. It was a telegram, the paper crisp and cool in his hand, bearing a message from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The words were a plea, an invitation, and a challenge all at once. It spoke of the struggle for the soul of the nation and called upon clergy of all faiths to join the movement in Selma. James felt the texture of the telegram between his fingers, the ink slightly raised, the message vibrating with an urgency that seemed to pulse against his skin. He thought of his 4 young children, John, Karen, Anne, and Stephen, sleeping soundly in their beds, safe from the storms of the South. He looked at the familiar objects of his life, the worn spine of a favorite book, the scratched surface of the dining table, the steady tick of the clock on the mantel. Everything felt suddenly fragile. He told Marie he had to go. He spoke of the need to bear witness, to stand with those who were suffering. His voice was soft, but it carried the unyielding strength of a mountain stream. Marie felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach, a premonition she couldn't name, but she saw the light of purpose in his eyes. It was the kind of fight he believed in, and she knew that to ask him to stay would be to ask him to quiet the very heart that made him the man she loved. By the evening of March 8th, James stood on the curb at Logan Airport. The smell of jet fuel and the damp, salty mist of the Atlantic filled the air. He wore a simple dark overcoat, his hands tucked into his pockets to shield them from the wind. He kissed Marie goodbye, a brief, tender moment amidst the rushing travelers and the roar of engines. It was the last time she would see him in the clear, sharp light of consciousness. As the plane ascended, the lights of Boston faded into a tapestry of amber and white, vanishing beneath a blanket of clouds. The flight was a transition between worlds. He sat in the cramped seat, the vibration of the aircraft a constant, low-frequency thrum against his spine. Around him, other ministers and activists spoke in hushed tones, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. As they flew southward, the geography of the country shifted beneath them, moving from the frozen earth of the north to the softening, waking soil of the south. When the doors of the plane eventually opened in the deep south, the air that rushed in was different. It was heavy, laden with moisture, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was a thick, velvet warmth that felt unfamiliar against his skin, a sensory reminder that he had stepped into a landscape where the rules of the world he knew no longer applied. The night air was alive with the sound of crickets, a rhythmic, shimmering chorus that seemed to warn of the tensions simmering beneath the surface of the Alabama darkness. He arrived in Selma under the cover of a humid night. The town was a maze of quiet streets and looming shadows, where the oak trees draped in Spanish moss looked like weeping giants in the moonlight. He made his way toward Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the spiritual heart of the movement. As he approached, the sound of singing began to drift through the open doors, a low, powerful swell of harmony that seemed to vibrate the very air. Inside, the church was packed, the pews overflowing with people whose faces were etched with the weariness of a long struggle. The scent of candle wax and sweat and old wood filled the sanctuary. James took his place among the hundreds of other clergy who had answered the call. He looked at the polished wood of the pulpit, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and he felt a profound sense of belonging. The tension in Selma was a physical thing, a static charge that made the hair on his arms stand up. Outside, the world was hostile, a place of sirens and watchful eyes behind screened porches, but inside the chapel, there was a warmth that felt like a shield. He listened to the voices rising in song, the ancient spirituals reinvented for a new era, and he felt the fear he had carried from Boston begin to transform into something else. A steady, quiet courage that settled in his bones like the cooling evening mist. As the night deepened, James walked the streets of Selma toward his temporary lodging. The pavement was uneven beneath his shoes, the cracks filled with the red clay of Alabama. He noticed the way the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows of the telephone poles, creating a lattice of darkness across the road. The air was still, almost breathless, as if the entire town was holding its collective breath, waiting for the morning and the march that was to come. He passed houses where the lights were extinguished, but he could sense the eyes watching from the darkness. The silence of the southern night was not like the silence of Boston. It was layered, filled with the ghosts of the past and the anxieties of the present. He thought of his children again, imagining them safe in their beds, and he felt a sudden, sharp longing for the mundane comforts of home, the smell of morning coffee, the sound of his daughter's laughter. But he stood firm. He was here to walk the bridge that had seen so much blood, to offer his presence as a barrier against hatred. He finally reached the home where he would sleep, a modest house offered by a local family. He lay down on the unfamiliar bed, the sheets smelling of sun-dried cotton and lavender. The hum of a small electric fan was the only sound in the room, a whirring lullaby that competed with the distant, low growl of a passing truck. James closed his eyes, his mind a kaleidoscope of the day's events, and drifted into a restless sleep, unaware that the quietude of this Alabama night was the final calm before a storm that would change the course of history and claim the very life he had traveled so far to offer. The warmth inside Walker's Cafe was more than just a reprieve from the cooling evening air of March 9th, 1965. It was a sensory sanctuary, a place where the humidity of the kitchen clung to the windows in a thick, translucent fog, blurring the harsh world of Selma into a soft, golden haze. Within those walls, the atmosphere was heavy with the rich, savory perfume of soul food. The deep, earthy scent of collard greens simmered for hours, the sharp saltiness of frying fat, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of fresh cornbread. James Reeb sat at one of the small, modest tables, his body finally beginning to uncoil from the bone-deep tension of the day's events. Around him, the low, rhythmic murmur of conversation rose and fell like a tide, punctuated by the rhythmic clinking of heavy ceramic plates and the bright, metallic ring of silverware against glass. It was a crowded space, teeming with activists and locals alike, all drawn to one of the few integrated havens where skin color did not dictate the seat you took. The light in the room was dim, cast by fixtures that seemed to struggle against the encroaching night, throwing long, gentle shadows across the faces of those who had come to Selma to change the course of history. Sitting with James were his fellow ministers, Orloff Miller and Clark Olson. They were men of faith who had heeded the urgent call of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., traveling from the familiar streets of Boston and Berkeley to this volatile corner of Alabama. As they waited for their dinner, the exhaustion of the afternoon, the prayer on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the uncertain retreat of Turnaround Tuesday settled over them like a weighted blanket. The cafe was so overwhelmed by the sudden influx of hungry marchers that the kitchen was struggling to keep pace with the orders. There was a quiet, shared irony when Orloff Miller's request for a steak was met with a plate of fried chicken instead. In the spirit of the movement and the communal hunger of the room, he simply smiled and accepted the meal without a word of complaint. They ate with a focused, quiet intensity, the simple act of breaking bread together acting as a fragile shield against the hostility they knew waited just beyond the door. The wood of the table was worn smooth by decades of leaning elbows and whispered dreams, a tactile reminder of the many lives that had sought comfort in this very spot before them. After the meal was finished, James pushed himself up from the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He had a task to attend to, one that carried the weight of a husband's devotion and a father's longing. He walked toward the back of the cafe where a black, heavy-set payphone hung against the wall. The cord was coiled and slightly frayed, a lifeline stretching back toward Boston. James fished into his pocket, the silver coins clinking together with a small, sharp sound before he slid them into the slot. The mechanical whir of the phone was a lonely sound in the busy room. When Marie answered on the other end, his voice softened, losing the weary edge of the activist and regaining the gentle lilt of a man who missed his wife and their 4 children. He spoke of the day, of the thousands of people who had gathered, and of the strange, quiet power of the prayer they had shared. He told her he was safe. He told her he would see her soon. The warmth of her voice was a ghost of a touch against his cheek, a memory of a home that felt thousands of miles away in the humid darkness of Alabama. He hung up the receiver with a lingering hand, the cold plastic a stark contrast to the heat of his words. While James was at the phone, Orloff Miller had stepped toward the front of the cafe, purchasing a cigar from the small counter near the entrance. It was a mundane, almost celebratory gesture, a moment of personal indulgence after a day of immense public pressure. He stepped out onto the sidewalk for a moment to light it, the match flaring briefly in the twilight, casting a sharp, orange glow over his features before fading into a tiny, drifting trail of smoke. The night air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, metallic tang of the Alabama River. The streetlights were just beginning to hum to life, casting circles of pale, sickly yellow onto the uneven pavement. Across the street, the Silver Moon Cafe stood in stark, silent opposition to walkers. It was a known gathering place for those who viewed the arrival of James and his companions with a cold, simmering hatred. The windows of the Silver Moon were dark and uninviting, like half-closed eyes watching the ministers through the gloom. There was a stillness in the air now, a vacuum of sound that seemed to swallow the distant noises of the town, leaving only the soft, rhythmic puffing of Orloff's cigar and the quiet thud of the cafe door as James and Clark stepped out to join him. At approximately 7:30, the 3 men began their walk back toward the Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. They moved in a loose line, their shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete. James walked on the outside, closest to the curb, his coat buttoned against the slight chill that had begun to rise from the ground. Clark Olson walked on the inside, near the storefronts, with Orloff in the middle, the faint cherry-red glow of his cigar a tiny beacon in the darkness. The shadows between the streetlights were deep and ink-black, stretching across the road like reaching fingers. The ministers were talking softly, perhaps planning for the mass meeting that awaited them, or perhaps simply reflecting on the strange, electric energy of the town. They were 3 men of peace, their heads bowed slightly against the wind, unaware that the silence of the street was not an absence of sound, but a held breath. Behind them, the light of Walker's cafe faded into a distant, golden speck, and before them, the darkness of Washington Street opened up like a void. Every step took them further from the safety of the table and closer to the hidden figures waiting in the mouth of an alleyway, their hands gripped tight around heavy, blunt objects, their eyes fixed on the three strangers who had dared to walk the night air of Selma. The warmth of Walker's cafe lingered in their coats as the three ministers stepped back out onto the sidewalk of Selma. The air was heavy, thick with the damp humidity that often clings to the Alabama riverfront in the early spring of 1965. It was a Tuesday evening, March 9th, and the town felt held in a strange, breathless suspension. Behind them, the sounds of clinking silverware and low, supportive murmurs faded, replaced by the rhythmic clicking of their own dress shoes against the concrete. They were walking toward the light, or so they thought, heading back to the Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where the pulse of the movement was strongest. James Reeb walked on the outside, closest to the curb, his slight frame moving with a steady, quiet purpose. Beside him were Clark Olson and Orloff Miller, their shoulders nearly touching as they navigated the dimming light of the street. The street lamps cast long, stretching shadows that seemed to pull at their heels, and the scent of damp earth and diesel hung in the stagnant air. They were men of faith, outsiders who had answered a call to witness, and in that moment, the walk felt like a simple extension of their prayers. As they moved further down the street, the atmosphere began to shift. The inclusive, protective bubble of the neighborhood they had just left started to thin, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. They were approaching a stretch of Broad Street that felt different. Here, the storefronts were darker, the windows like closed eyes. They passed the Silver Moon Cafe, a place known to local residents as a scruffy, whites-only establishment. It was a low-slung building, the kind of place where the smell of stale beer and deep-fried grease seeped through the cracks in the door. Through the glass, the interior was a haze of yellow light and wood smoke, a sharp contrast to the gathering shadows of the sidewalk. The ministers kept their eyes forward, their pace steady, but the silence of the street was starting to feel heavy, like a weight pressing against their chests. The pavement beneath their feet was uneven, worn down by decades of footsteps, and every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of a passing car, seemed amplified in the quiet of the evening. They were three men in a town divided by invisible lines, and they were about to cross one they could never uncross. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. From across the darkened street, movement erupted. Four men emerged from the shadows like ghosts materializing from the gloom. They didn't just walk, they converged. The sound of their heavy boots on the asphalt was a sudden, violent percussion against the quiet night. Before the ministers could even process the threat, a voice tore through the air, thick with a jagged, hateful energy. A slur was hurled like a stone, followed by the jagged demand of, "Hey, you niggers." The word felt like a physical blow even before the violence began. The attackers were closing the distance rapidly, their faces obscured by the dim light, but their intent was written in the aggressive lean of their bodies. They carried the weight of a local fury, a deep-seated resentment toward the outsiders who had come to disturb the status quo of Selma. James, Clark, and Orloff tightened their formation, perhaps instinctively trying to shield one another, but the sidewalk was narrow and the darkness was absolute. There was no time for a plea, no time for a prayer, and no time to run. The four men were upon them in a heartbeat, bringing with them a darkness far deeper than the night. One of the men, moving with a terrifying, practiced speed, swung a heavy club. It was a blunt instrument, some say a length of pipe or a sturdy piece of wood, and it moved through the air with a sickening whistle. James Reeb never saw it coming. He was struck with full force on the left side of his head, just above the temple. The sound of the impact was a dull, wet thud that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. It was a sound that Clark Olson would later say haunted his dreams for decades. James didn't scream. He simply collapsed. His body folded as if the bones had turned to sand, and he hit the concrete with a heavy, final weight. He lay there, his head resting against the cold stone, babbling incoherent, soft words that made no sense to the chaos unfolding around him. The other 3 attackers didn't stop with the first blow. They swarmed Clark and Orloff, raining down punches and kicks. Clark felt his glasses fly from his face, the world turning into a blurred smear of gray and black as he was shoved toward the ground. Orloff, trained in the ways of nonviolence, dropped into a prayer position, curling his body to protect his vitals as the heavy boots of the men found his ribs and back. The violence was brief, but it felt like an eternity. Inside the Silver Moon Cafe, just feet away, the customers looked out through the glass windows. They saw the struggle, the falling bodies, and the flash of the club in the streetlight. But no one moved. No one opened the door to shout for a stop, and no one reached for a telephone to call for help. They watched the scene as if it were a distant, silent film, their faces impassive behind the safety of the glass. The 4 attackers, satisfied with the damage they had wrought, turned and vanished back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. The street returned to its eerie quiet, save for the ragged breathing of the 3 ministers. James Reeb remained on the ground, his eyes unfocused, a thin trail of liquid beginning to pool beneath his head, though there was surprisingly little blood at first. The injury was internal, a catastrophic fracture that was already beginning to swell against his brain. Clark and Orloff, bruised and shaken, struggled to their feet, their hands trembling as they reached down to their fallen friend. The air was colder now, the humid warmth of the dinner at Walker's Cafe completely extinguished by the sudden, brutal reality of the sidewalk in the dark. The walk back to the church, which should have taken minutes, now felt like an impossible journey through a hostile wilderness. Every shadow seemed to hold another threat, and every passing car felt like a predator. They managed to get James to his feet, supporting his weight between them as he stumbled, his legs trailing like leaden weights. He was conscious, but he wasn't there. He was drifting into a foggy, distant place where the pain couldn't reach him. They moved through the darkness of Broad Street, 2 men holding up the broken body of a third, their shadows merging into a single, limping shape against the brick walls of Selma. Behind them, the Silver Moon Cafe remained illuminated, a beacon of indifference in a night that had suddenly become a nightmare. They didn't know yet that the blow delivered on that sidewalk would echo across the entire nation, or that within 48 hours, the name James Reeb would be spoken by the President of the United States. All they knew in that moment was the coldness of the night, the weight of their friend, and the terrifying realization that in this town, even the sidewalk was a battlefield. The air in Selma that Tuesday night was thick and heavy, a humid blanket that seemed to press down on the frantic group as they carried James toward any hope of help. They reached the Barwell Infirmary, a modest building that stood as a sanctuary for the Black community, its hallways smelling of sharp rubbing alcohol and the faint, sweet scent of floor wax that had been layered on over many decades. The light inside was a pale, flickering yellow, casting long and jittery shadows against the wood-paneled walls and the tired faces of the medical staff. Doctors moved with a quiet, practiced urgency, their eyes reflecting the exhaustion of 1,000 battles already fought against the tides of inequality. They looked at James, whose breathing was now heavy and irregular, a ragged sound that filled the small examination room. They knew immediately that the trauma was far beyond their reach. The blow to his skull had been precise and devastating, shattering more than just bone. There was no neurosurgeon in Selma who would or could take the case, and no equipment to navigate the delicate, broken architecture of his mind. The only hope, a slim and distant one, lay over 80 miles to the north in the city of Birmingham. A funeral home ambulance was summoned, a heavy and somber black vehicle that felt more like a carriage for the departed than a vessel for the living. As they lifted James onto the narrow cot, the metal casters clicked and groaned against the linoleum floor, a rhythmic and haunting sound that echoed through the silent ward. The ambulance pulled away from the curb, its engine a low and guttering growl that sent a constant vibration through the thin floorboards and into the marrow of those inside. Within the cramped rear compartment, the air felt stale and ancient, a mixture of old leather, the sharp tang of medicinal spirits, and the faint, lingering smell of formaldehyde. Every bump in the winding road sent a jarring jolt through the vehicle, causing the heavy medical bags to slide across the floor and the oxygen tanks to clank against their metal restraints with a cold, ringing finality. Outside the narrow windows, the world was a blur of ink-black pines and the occasional flickering porch light of a distant farmhouse, lonely beacons in a landscape that felt increasingly hostile. The driver pushed the vehicle as fast as the aging suspension would allow, the headlights cutting a fragile, yellow path through the gathering mist of the Alabama night. The two ministers who sat beside James in the dim glow of the cabin kept their hands folded, their knuckles white, as their lips moved in silent and desperate prayers. They watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest, a motion so fragile it seemed to be the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. The road felt endless, a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt that stretched into a void where time had no meaning. They had only just cleared the outskirts of the town when the night was suddenly pierced by an aggressive, strobe-like flash of blue and red. The siren of a police cruiser wailed behind them, a shrill and demanding cry that tore through the quiet of the woods. The ambulance driver slowed, his hands trembling against the steering wheel, and pulled onto the soft, gravel shoulder of the highway. The silence that followed the engine's cut was deafening, broken only by the crunch of heavy leather boots on the stones outside. A flashlight beam cut through the rear window, blinding and intrusive, dancing over the face of the unconscious man as if searching for a reason to turn them back. An officer moved with a slow and deliberate indifference, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the road as he approached the driver's side window. The officer did not ask about the condition of the man dying in the back. He did not offer an escort or ask if they needed a clear path through the night. Instead, he demanded papers and identification, his voice a flat, southern drawl that carried the heavy weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Every second spent in that standoff was a second stolen from the life of James Reeb. The ticking of a wristwatch became a thunderous pulse in the ears of the ministers. 10 minutes passed, then 15, as the officer circled the vehicle with agonizing slowness, checking the lights, the tires, and the registration with a meticulousness that was clearly meant to obstruct rather than serve. It was a cold and calculated display of power, a reminder that on this dark stretch of road, mercy was a luxury they did not possess and would not be granted. When the ambulance was finally allowed to proceed, the driver was so shaken that the steering wheel felt like ice in his grip. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point, the air thick with the realization that the law they relied upon for protection had become the very obstacle to their survival. But the road was not finished with them yet. Deep in the rural darkness, a sudden and violent shudder rocked the ambulance as a tire surrendered to the jagged edges of the neglected highway. The sound of the blowout was like a gunshot, echoing through the empty forest and sending a spray of gravel against the undercarriage. The vehicle drifted and swayed, the driver wrestling with the heavy wheel until they came to a grinding, dusty halt in the dirt. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, with a man whose life was slowly leaking away into the shadows. The sound of the wind whistling through the tall pines was the only company they had as they worked in the mud to change the tire. Their fingers were slick with grease and the cold moisture of the night air, their movements clumsy and frantic with panic. James lay perfectly still, his eyes closed, and his face a mask of pale marble in the flickering light of a handheld torch. The irony was a bitter, heavy weight to bear, to have survived the physical violence of the street, only to be held captive by the indifference of the machinery and the quiet malice of the isolation. They were fighting against a clock that was running down in the silence of the Alabama woods. The final stretch of the journey to Birmingham was a blur of exhaustion, grief, and the rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of the engine. As the skyline of the city finally appeared on the horizon, a cluster of artificial stars against the deep purple and gray of the pre-dawn sky, the sense of urgency shifted into a somber and hollow realization. The journey that should have taken 2 hours had stretched into an eternity of delays and detours. They pulled into the sterile, brightly lit entrance of the university hospital, where the air was cold and smelled of ozone and industrial cleaners. The transition from the lawless, humid darkness of the rural highway to the white and clinical halls of the medical center was jarring and surreal. Nurses and orderlies swarmed the ambulance as soon as it stopped, their voices sharp and professional as they coordinated the move. But as the gurney was pulled from the back of the vehicle, there was a look in their eyes, a brief, flickering recognition that suggested they already knew what the outcome would be. As James was wheeled away toward the operating theater, the sound of the gurney's wheels on the polished tile was a frantic, high-pitched scream. The long road to Birmingham had ended, but the mercy they had traveled so far to find felt further away than ever before. The transition from the sterile, hushed corridors of the hospital in Birmingham to the heavy, stagnant air of the Dallas County Courthouse in Selma felt like descending from a cold mountain into a swamp. By December of 1965, the heat of the summer had technically faded, but a different kind of warmth lingered within the thick stone walls of the courthouse. It was a heat born of bodies packed into wooden pews, of breath held in anticipation, and of a social tension that felt as thick and cloying as velvet. The courthouse itself stood as a monument to a world that refused to turn. Inside, the floors were made of wide, dark planks of oak that groaned under the slightest weight, sounding like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat as the bailiffs paced the aisles. The air carried the scent of floor wax, old paper, and the faint, metallic tang of the heating pipes. High above, the ceiling fans turned with a hypnotic, lazy wobble, cutting through the dust motes that danced in the long shafts of afternoon light. It was in this room, beneath the gaze of portraits of men from a century prior, that the investigation into the death of James Reeb would finally reach its public climax. The town outside was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, a collective waiting for a ritual that many already believed had its conclusion written in the very grain of the wood. In the front of the room sat the 3 men accused of the beating that had claimed a life and stirred the conscience of a nation. Elmer Cook, a local store manager, William Stanley Hoggle, a salesman, and his brother Naaman O'Neill Hoggle, an auto mechanic. They sat together at a long, scarred table, their shoulders occasionally brushing. They were men of the community, familiar faces in the shops and on the street corners of Selma. Their defense attorney, Joseph Pilcher, moved with a practiced, comfortable ease, his voice a low rumble that seemed to harmonize with the surroundings. Across from them sat the prosecution, including Circuit Solicitor Blanchard McLeod. The atmosphere was strange, almost collegiate, as if everyone in the room were part of a secret that the visiting ministers from the North could never hope to understand. The jury box was filled with 12 white men, their faces etched with the weariness of the working day and a stoic, unreadable expression. Among them sat Harry Vardaman, whose brother, Ben, was slated to be a key witness for the defense. It was a detail that hung in the air like a heavy mist, a clear sign of the interwoven threads of family and loyalty that bound this room together. The judge, L.S. Moore, presided from a high bench, his movements slow and deliberate as he adjusted his spectacles and looked out over the sea of faces, his authority absolute in this small, crowded kingdom. When the Reverend Clark Olson and the Reverend Orloff Miller were called to the stand, the silence in the room shifted from heavy to sharp. Their voices, carrying the distinct, clipped cadences of the North, seemed to bounce off the walls like stones skipped across a frozen pond. They spoke of that night in March, of the walk away from Walker's Cafe, and of the sudden, brutal shadows that had emerged from the darkness. Olson described the sight of Elmer Cook, his hand steady as he pointed to the man in the courtroom, identifying him as one of the assailants who had descended upon them with such senseless fury. But as he spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew colder. The defense's cross-examination was not merely a questioning of facts, but a subtle dismantling of the minister's very presence in Alabama. Pilcher's questions were laced with the suggestion that these outsiders had come seeking trouble, that their presence was an intrusion upon the peace of Selma. He leaned in close to the witness stand, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that the jury leaned forward to catch. He planted a dark, silver-tongued seed in the minds of the listeners, suggesting that perhaps the civil rights movement had needed a martyr so badly that they had let James Reeb die on purpose, delaying his care to ensure his transition from a man into a symbol. It was a cruel, baseless theory, but in the hush of that courtroom, it was treated with the weight of a serious inquiry. The prosecution's case, already struggling against the current of local sentiment, suffered blow after blow as the days progressed. One key eyewitness, Edgar Stripling, was barred from the stand entirely. The judge ruled him incompetent to testify, citing a history of mental health treatment from years prior, effectively erasing a voice that might have provided the clarity the case so desperately needed. Then there was R.B. Kelly, another man initially arrested for the assault. He sat in the courtroom but refused to speak, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The silence from the witness stand became a character in the trial, a void where truth was supposed to reside. The defense called a parade of local residents who provided alibis for the Hoggle brothers and Elmer Cook, their testimonies forming a seamless wall of protection around the accused. They spoke of the men being elsewhere, of ordinary evenings spent in ordinary ways, while the ministers from the north looked on in a state of quiet, helpless disbelief. The physical evidence, including a club seized from a car, seemed to lose its power in the face of these verbal reassurances. The trial was less an investigation of a crime and more a performance of community solidarity, a way for the city to signal to the world that its internal clock would not be reset by the hands of strangers. By the time the closing arguments were delivered, the outcome felt as inevitable as the setting of the sun. The prosecution pleaded for justice, for the recognition of a human life lost to violence, but their words seemed to drift aimlessly through the rafters, never quite finding a place to land. Joseph Pilcher's final words to the jury were a masterful appeal to their identity, a call to protect their own against the encroaching tides of change. The jury retired to deliberate, and the courtroom descended into a low, buzzing hum. People stretched their legs, adjusted their collars, and waited. They did not have to wait long. In less than 90 minutes, a heartbeat in the world of legal proceedings, the 12 men returned. The sound of their footsteps returning to the box was the only noise in the room. The verdict was read, not guilty for all 3 men. A wave of relief, almost like a physical sigh, swept through the white spectators. The Hoggle brothers and Elmer Cook shook hands with their attorney, their faces finally breaking into smiles. In the back of the room, a few people wept, but their voices were drowned out by the scraping of chairs and the low, satisfied murmurs of the crowd. The case was closed. The courthouse doors swung open, letting in the cool evening air, but the silence that followed the verdict was the heaviest thing of all, a quiet that seemed to swallow the memory of the man who had traveled so far only to be forgotten by the law in the very place he sought to change. The courtroom in Selma had fallen into a heavy, suffocating silence after the verdict was read in December of 1965. Outside, the winter air was uncharacteristically thick, clinging to the brickwork of the buildings like a damp wool blanket. Inside, the mahogany benches groaned under the weight of a town, divided by a line that no law seemed able to bridge. It had taken the all-white, all-male jury only 90 minutes to decide that the 3 men accused of the murder of James Reeb were not guilty. 90 minutes to undo months of investigation. 90 minutes to sweep the shattered remains of a life under the rug of local tradition. The defendants, Elmer Cook, William Stanley Hoggle, and Naaman O'Neill Hoggle, walked out into the pale afternoon light as free men. Behind them, the shadows in the Dallas County Courthouse seemed to lengthen, stretching across the floorboards where the echoes of testimony from Clark Olson and Orloff Miller still lingered, unheeded. The injustice of that moment didn't just hang in the air. It settled into the very soil of Selma, a bitter seed that would take decades to fully reveal its dark fruit. But while justice faltered in the local courts, the ghost of James Reeb was already walking the halls of power in Washington. Only 4 days after his heart had stopped beating in a Birmingham hospital, 70 million Americans sat before their television sets, the screens flickering with the black and white image of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. The president's voice was a low, gravelly rumble as he addressed a joint session of Congress. He spoke of Selma as a turning point in man's unending search for freedom, comparing it to the hallowed grounds of Lexington and Concord. He mentioned the name of the white minister from Boston. And then, in a moment that sent a shiver through the nation, he adopted the very anthem of the movement, declaring with slow, deliberate emphasis, "And we shall overcome." The air in the Capitol felt electric, charged with the realization that the blood spilled on a sidewalk in Alabama had become the ink for the Voting Rights Act. When the president finally put his pen to paper on August 6, 1965, the scratch of the nib was a sound that traveled across the miles, reaching back to the corners of the Silver Moon Cafe and the quiet, mourning home of Marie Reeb. Decades drifted by like the slow, muddy waters of the Alabama River. The heat of that 1965 summer faded into the cool, gray amnesia of history. The men who had been acquitted grew older, their faces becoming etched with the lines of time, their secrets tucked away in the attics of their minds. Elmer Cook passed away in 1972, taking his silence to the grave. R.B. Kelly followed in 1994, and William Hoggle in 1996. The world was changing outside. The signs for whites only were gone, the laws were different, and the dust had settled on the old files of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But for the family of James Reeb, and for the people of Selma who remembered the sound of that club hitting bone, the case was never truly closed. It was a cold, dormant thing, waiting for the light of a new century to find it. The memory of the minister didn't fade. It became a quiet, persistent hum in the background of the civil rights story, a reminder of the cost of a single vote and the weight of a life given for a stranger's dignity. In 2007, a new wind began to blow. The Justice Department, spurred by the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, turned its gaze backward toward the shadows. Investigators reopened the file on James Reeb, pulling out the yellowed statements and the grainy photographs of a car that once held a wooden club. They interviewed more than 50 people, trying to find a thread that hadn't been frayed by the passage of 40 years. The air in the interrogation rooms was different now. The fear that had once gagged witnesses had softened into a weary desire for truth. But the law is a rigid thing. By May of 2011, the Department of Justice issued a notice to close the file. The only man still living who had been tried, Naaman Hoggle, was protected by the shield of double jeopardy. The others were gone, beyond the reach of any earthly court. The official report concluded that there were no new leads, no hidden evidence that could change the ending of the story. The investigation ended with a quiet stack of papers, a formal acknowledgement that the truth might be known, but justice would remain elusive. Yet, history has a way of breathing even when the law is finished. In 2019, journalists digging through the old lies of Selma found a voice that had been overlooked. They found an 89-year-old man named William Portwood, who, in the twilight of his life, admitted he was there on that night. He confessed to kicking someone, a small, horrific detail added to a larger tapestry of violence. His admission didn't lead to a trial, but it offered a final, shivering clarity to the events. It confirmed what many had whispered in the dark for over half a century. Far from the humidity of Alabama, the physical remains of James Reeb found their final peace in a very different landscape. His ashes were not buried in the red clay of the South, but were scattered across the wide-open, sagebrush-covered plains of the Shirley Basin in Wyoming. There, the wind is constant and cold, and the horizon stretches forever under a sky that knows no boundaries. It is a place of absolute silence and profound space, a contrast to the narrow, crowded streets where he met his end. As we leave the story of James Reeb, we are left with the image of those ashes dancing on a Wyoming breeze, drifting over the prairie grass and the quiet earth. The legacy he left behind is not found in the court transcripts or the names of his attackers, but in the millions of hands that have reached for a ballot since 1965. The mystery of the heart and the mystery of the law have intersected here, leaving us with a story that is as much about the endurance of memory as it is about the failure of justice. The heavy Alabama heat, the smell of Walker's Cafe, the sound of the television in the minister's home, all of it begins to soften now. The struggle is over. The long walk has reached its end. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.